In fact, this theme of strengthening democracy is globally topical and will be just as relevant in countries like the United States of America, South Africa, South Korea, Mozambique, Senegal, Sierra Leone, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, and Ghana, to mention a few. Ladies and gentlemen, between 2020 and 2023, there have been about 8 coup d'etats in Africa. A few leaders have also changed or are changing their constitutions to allow them to stay in power beyond their constitutionally mandated terms. The increasing fragility of democracy in Africa and across the world is cause for concern. In democratic countries, the will of the people is expressed through elections, and leaders, especially incumbents, must trust the electoral process and accept the will of the people for the survival of democracy. Ladies and gentlemen, the year 2024 has been described as the year of political disruption because out of elections held in 16 countries, incumbents lost 80% of the elections, largely on account of increased cost of living following the COVID pandemic, amongst other reasons. We have seen major examples of this political disruption in countries like South Africa, the United Kingdom, the USA, Japan, India, Sierra Leone, Botswana, and Senegal, to mention a few. In Ghana, the presidential and parliamentary elections were held just last month. As an incumbent vice president, I was also the ruling party candidate for the presidency. Before the election, there was the usual anxiety expressed by the opposition, as well as the diplomatic community. And we have this expression of anxiety virtually in every election. But there was this anxiety expressed by the diplomatic community and the opposition about the transparency, credibility, and fairness of the impending election. The opposition claimed that government had a plan to rig the election. I believe this is a standard claim by all opposition parties in any election in Africa. Frankly, notwithstanding the above, I, as the presidential candidate of my party, I was confident in Ghana's electoral process, as the Electoral Commission had demonstrated over time fairness and transparency. In fact, in Ghana, we spent quite a lot of time on electoral reform over the years. In addition to this, I was confident of winning the election on December 7th, based on what I considered to be the solid record of achievement, notwithstanding the economic challenges we faced. However, when the polls closed on December 7th and counting began, we started receiving the results from our party's collation centers. We had set up very elaborate 6 scheme of collecting our results, and we started receiving the results from our collation centers. By 3 a.m. on Sunday, because the election was on Saturday, it was obvious from the data that we had received from our collation centers that my opponent, the former president and now president, John Mahama, had decisively won the election. I knew, so by 3 a.m. I had come to this conclusion that we had lost the election. I knew it would take between 48 to 72 hours for the Electoral Commission to collate and announce the official results. I was very cognizant of the tension and the potential violence that could result if there was a long, drawn-out process of announcing the results. Indeed, the tension had begun to mount. I therefore took the decision to hold a press conference at 9 a.m. the next morning. I asked for them to call the press the next morning at 9 a.m. to concede the election to my opponent, even before the EC had announced the results. You can imagine how incredulous some of even my team members were about my decision to do this. They said, we have to wait for the EC. And I said, our data collation, I believe, is correct. The EC will not have any different data from what we have collected. So I believe that my concession within 14 hours of the close of the polls was in the supreme interest of Ghana's democracy and peace. The people had decided, and we had to respect their decision without any equivocation. The politicians' ambition must, and I repeat, must never supersede the interest of your nation. Ambition can always be seen for a politician in two dimensions. You have a personal ambition, but you also have an ambition for your country. Most of the time, when we talk of ambition, we are only talking about personal ambition. The ambition for the country is relegated. We don't talk about ambition. When you ask somebody what is your ambition, it's usually coming up about personal ambition. But for a politician, you face these two dimensions of ambition. And the ambition for your country. For democracy to survive and to thrive and to be strengthened, the ambition for the country must be paramount and must supersede the ambition for yourself. Ladies and gentlemen, elections are not do or die affairs. That's what we must understand. The right of the citizen to choose leaders in a free, transparent manner is sacrosanct and remains one of the most vital anchors of a true democratic dispensation by choosing and/or changing leaders through the ballot box, though necessary, is not sufficient to guarantee a true flourishing democratic culture. Ladies and gentlemen, there are several other imperatives, including the often taken for granted issues that, when combined with peaceful and credible elections, enrich and sustain our democracy. I therefore propose to continue with the rest of my speech by looking at the common threats to our democracy, and then proceed to suggest, in my opinion, the things we can do to grow a democratic culture that is resilient enough to deliver governance, economic, and social dividends. Ladies and gentlemen, one of the most important determinants of a flourishing democracy is the quality of institutions. Institutions capable of guaranteeing rights, including property rights, and checking the wanton abuse of power. These institutions include the independent election management bodies, the judiciary, the ombudsman, the police, other law enforcement agencies, and many others. One of the most topical issues about economic growth, and as an economist, I follow this literature closely. One of the most important topical issues about economic growth that has been extensively discussed by development economists is the now famous institutions versus geography debate. Celebrated economists like Dele have come up to the firm conclusion that when it comes to the determinants of growth, the quality of institutions towers above everything else. Unfortunately, whilst the culture of peacefully choosing leaders is being entrenched, these institutions that should determine our growth are becoming weak and endangered. Several reasons account for this. First, when we place partisan, ethnic, and other interests over and above competence in appointments to these institutions, we are simply creating mere edifices and structures to reward cronies, creating avenues for reluctant Democrats to get a backdoor route to autocracy and misgovernance. There is a growing phenomenon in our democracy whereby people deliberately run down these independent and accountability institutions purely on emotive reasons, especially when these institutions decide, as they should, to uphold the law in the interest of the masses and in strict fidelity to the law. Ladies and gentlemen, it is rather alarming that sometimes these bastardizations of the institutions are undertaken by people with loud voices, people with professional and technical pedigrees, and people who know the truth as espoused by these institutions. For these people, partisan and sectional interests are often packaged as technical and professional opinions, thereby setting up these institutions up for public ridicule, scorn, and disdain. This has often set the stage for people with no appreciation of the issues at stake to run amok, eroding public confidence in these institutions and causing substantial damage to our democracy. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I need to touch on a closely related matter to the quality of institutions. Indeed, it is an extension of that point. It is about what we used to know in the past. In times when democracy was threatened, it was usually the case that a group of people with a known leader would take up arms and assume control of state power and institutions. The group or its leader would proceed to abolish elections, ultimately collapse democracy, and declare a dictatorship. This is gradually giving way, even though a few spots still exist for this path to toppling the democratic order, as we have seen in the sub-region recently. In place of that is an orchestrated hollowing out of democratic structures and processes and taking full control of the state and related organs, making it nearly impossible for the political opposition to win elections. This is a potent way to bury democracy by placing form over substance and depriving democracy of its essential functions. In other words, the form is democratic, but the substance is obdurate dictatorship. Ladies and gentlemen, one of the biggest threats to democracy today is what I call the next meal principle. Before I make my point, I need to re-echo the words of one of Africa's greatest sons, the distinguished Nelson Mandela, who said that as long as poverty, injustice, and gross inequality exist in our world, none of us can truly rest, end quote. Democracy must be a means to an end. The best democracy is the one that delivers public goods and services effectively and efficiently and creates opportunities for citizens whilst making conscious efforts to leave no one behind. For sub-Saharan Africa, the data suggests make or unmake democracy. Across the world, we have seen young people stand up to dictatorial or non-functional governance architectures, bringing in ugly outcomes in certain cases. These have often happened because young people are considered the next generation and have a bounden duty to ensure that the actions we take today do not jeopardize their future. Viewed from that lens, one is tempted to say young people have played key roles in rescuing failing democratic systems by confronting and defying dictatorships or systems that are no longer fit for purpose. But there is a catch, ladies and gentlemen. We know that the youth demographic is not necessarily homogeneous, and that comes with some challenges. In many cases, some young people have rather helped misgovernance to fester by becoming proxies to perpetuate injustice and or obstruct the smooth functioning of systems that will promote good governance. So I've presented two scenarios: the youth as enablers of democratic sustenance and the youth as outlets for misgovernance. But whichever lens one views this, the real pointer can only be one thing. We need to ensure that democracy delivers inclusive opportunities. The productive energies of our young people need to be harnessed properly to empower them to play positive roles in the democratic sustenance. This suggestion, I want to share once again some figures from the 2023 Open Society Barometer report with you. When I read this report, I was shocked to find out that 30% and 38% of young people in Nigeria and Ghana, respectively, said army rule was good for the citizen. Yes, that's quite high. That is food for thought. Ladies and gentlemen, we cannot talk about a deepening democratic culture without devoting time to the role of the citizen? Have we played our roles in sustaining democracy? To answer this question, I first borrow some lines from President Barack Obama. And he says, and I quote, "The role of the citizen in our democracy does not end with your vote," end quote. Deepening and sustaining our democracy will require that citizens step up to the plate and show a greater voice, a voice that is long on policy coherence and strengthening systems, and a voice that is short on rhetoric and plain political partisan verbiage. In that way, we can hold political office holders accountable for their actions and teleguide government's efforts towards strengthening and consolidating democratic governance. Ladies and gentlemen, I apply to multiple sectors, institutions, and structures. Nigeria has been a leader for many years on many fronts, not only in sub-Saharan Africa, but across the globe. At the sub-regional level, Nigeria has played a father figure role in economic support and diplomacy, peacekeeping, and restoring democracy in some instances. It is expected that the steady progress being made in democratic governance will be strengthened and sustained. We therefore need to work assiduously to strengthen democracy by staying true to its prerequisites. Despite the imperfections of democracy, it remains the preferred form of governance that can guarantee individual liberties and rights. Prime Minister Winston Churchill beautifully summarized this point in a line that said, and I quote, "Democracy is the worst form of government except for all others," unquote. Ladies and gentlemen, the 2023 Open Society Barometer report also established that 92% of Nigerians say it is important to live in a democratically governed country, with a further 69% settling on democracy as the preferred form of government. This leaves nobody in doubt that democracy has taken root in Nigeria. Let us therefore strengthen it. I thank you for the opportunity. May God bless Nigeria. May God